Carole Nakhle, president of the Arab Energy Club and CEO of Crystol Energy. Carole, also from Lebanon, and this moment in Gaza, where the bombs have stopped dropping for now, at least, we're still seeing stress in the West Bank, where Israeli settlers and institutional military figures are continuously pressing the sort of encroachment onto Palestinian territory there. Lebanon is bombed nearly every day. I'm wondering, from your thoughts, bombed by the Israelis, that is, where do you see this moment? I know you're not a geopolitical analyst at the core of your expertise, but your expertise does reach in many centers than you are of the region. Just from a historical perspective, having lived through multiple turmoil in the region, does this feel like a change moment?
Oh, well, Sean, I mean, I love history and especially the history of the region. And I also have, as you said, the experience of being Lebanese. As I was born, I grew up in the civil war. I have the feeling that today, of course, what happened in Gaza, given the horrible scenario, what happened over the last 2 years, it's definitely a milestone. We were all waiting for this moment because we've had enough of innocent people being slaughtered. And not only that, even those who were not killed were a bit luckier to survive. The economic conditions that those people were living under were also terrible. So anything which is an improvement over what we had in Gaza recently is already a milestone. However, it would be naive to say that that's it, we turned the page and now we're going to all live happily ever after. There are structural problems that remain unsolved, and I really doubt that they would be resolved overnight. This is a problem that has been ongoing for decades. And I have to say, when there are innocent people who were killed, people don't easily forget. It takes generation to overcome this kind of atrocities. I mean, the children, especially Palestinian children, who saw their parents slaughtered in front of their eyes, they are not going to suddenly feel happy because they now have a little bit of peace in their region. So we shouldn't be naive. Of course, it's a moment to be celebrated because the atrocities must come to an end, but it does not mean that that's it. We should forget about what's happening from now on in Gaza and assume everything is okay. The problem with the human beings is that they tend to forget easily. But this problem is not that, it's stealing the headline from other important issues that we have in the region. We should continue to focus on the conditions in Gaza for the Palestinian people and also on widening the peace process across the region, because I really would love to see the Middle East having a lasting stability. Coming from the region, I don't have a long memory of anything which has lasted more than a year or two without a problem erupting here and there in the region, because we're not tackling the root problem in the region when it comes to geopolitical stability or lack of it.
Carole, your thoughts on that, sort of the not so much about Saudi or UAE, which we know has both the financial means and the commitment to continue to sustain their production capacity and maybe even grow it further in the case of the UAE. But what about the rest of the OPEC plus countries? You engage a lot right across the countries of that network. Their ability to continue to invest in new capacity or even to maintain current capacity levels. We've seen that African members of OPEC plus struggle with that. Where do you see the rest of that OPEC plus group and its ability to maintain their investment in capacity?
Well, if we want to think about expanding capacity, you have to think about investment and we have to think about who is leading that investment. So you mentioned, Sean, the African countries, I mean, Nigeria and other smaller players in that respect. Of course, they do have the potential. It's not that they don't have the resources. Actually, if I think about deep water and ultra deep water resources, I think Nigeria ranks in the top in the world, if not number one on some of those resources. But the problem is the cost of production, and the problem has always been investment. And investment is not just driven by prices. There are other important, because everybody's exposed to the same price everywhere. But the above ground factors, primarily government policy, play an important role, especially when you are relying to a largest extent on international capital. So Saudi Arabia is, you have Saudi Aramco, but in other countries you do have international players who have the choice of allocating their resources elsewhere. And in Nigeria, we already saw some exodus of the big players. Even they were there for decades. It's not suddenly left, partly because there are better opportunities elsewhere, and also because of the investment climate in Nigeria is not that attractive. So in that respect, I don't know, when people talk about expansion of capacity, where will that come from? Unless we see drastic changes in above ground factor, I don't see that coming. Now, outside the core members of OPEC, even when I think about the OPEC plus, Russia, for instance, Russia is struggling these days in terms of expanding its production because of the escalation of the war with Ukraine, and the Ukrainians intensifying their attacks on the energy infrastructure in Russia. So that also will affect its ability to expand its production, even though it is an important player within OPEC plus, and actually its production is not far from that of Saudi Arabia. It does not have the same luxury as Saudi Arabia. It is not a swing producer like Saudi Arabia. So if you just draw or plot the chart in a chart, the production profile of Saudi Arabia and Russia, you can easily see the flexibility that the Saudis have, which Russia does not have. So outside the core GCC members, I would say there is limited capacity expansion. That said, Iraq,
What
for
about just
example,
maintaining current capacity? I mean, Nigeria, amongst others, have struggled just to do that.
exactly. And that's because even maintaining that capacity requires continuous investment, because you do have natural decline in field. So it's not just about adding, even expanding, because it's not like planting a palm tree. You have to continue to keep on investing in existing production. But Sean, I want to mention something about Iraq, because Iraq seems to be eyeing even further production expansion when it comes to getting a bigger quota from OPEC and OPEC plus in general. And this is where I see a potential, because Iraq relies heavily on international companies which has invested a lot in the country, and they have the resources, the reserves, the low cost of production. So I would keep my eyes on Iraq in terms of production increase, because this is where we have seen the most material development. But let's see how they will negotiate that within OPEC.
Looking at that going forward, Carole, because on the sort of tangential sort of perimeters of that, there are things like sanctions, Iran, the dark fleet, the ability to curtail the illegal, not illegal, sort of sanctions busting in certain geographies, not in others. But when you take the full sort of parameters of this idea, where do you think there are intersections, or are there? Does Iran's sanctions get pulled back into focus now? Do other things like that, where actual oil flows become real, India starts to behave in terms of the G7 perspective of importing Russian sanctioned oil, etc.?
Well, you got my brain thinking, because you mentioned too many aspects, and we can spend hours on each one of them. But let me try to capture two things. But primarily, let's talk about sanctions and oil markets in general. If there is one lesson we learned throughout history of the oil industry, and I love to quote a court case from the 1800s, is that when they said that oil is like a wild animal, it will always escape if it finds an opening. And this is still the case today, because it's a liquid commodity, it's fluid, and it's very difficult to really track the molecule, especially when it goes through the processing and the refining and the distribution, etc. And so far we have seen that the sanctions do have an impact. We cannot underestimate the impact of sanctions and say they are completely ineffective, because, for example, whether Iran or Russia, they are being forced to sell their oil at a discount, and therefore generate less revenues than they would have otherwise gained if the sanctions were not in place. So sanctions do have an economic impact, and the pain becomes more felt over the longer they stay in place. And we look at the Iranian economy, right, and the situation there. They are it's not enviable, it did not collapse, but it's not really a healthy. I wouldn't want to live there under those conditions. But in terms of their impact on oil flows, actually sanctions are ineffective in terms of stopping the oil from being traded in the global market, whether directly or indirectly through the dark fleet, through, I don't know, some sophisticated ways to get the oil around. I mean, Iranian oil, I don't think it ever left the market. Maybe we had some losses, some constraints, that's at least what the numbers tell us, but we don't know what happens behind closed door. We don't know how those molecules really get to the market. And this is primarily because it's not like the international community is coming together to squeeze one country. The world is divided between Western powers and Asian buyers. And Asian buyers, they are not small buyers. They are the biggest importer of crude oil in the world. And they have been in this business for decades. So them and the countries under sanction, whether Iran or Russia or Venezuela, they have developed a sophisticated web of getting that oil still to the market. But of course, it is at discounted prices, and it does have an economic pain, but not impacting the trade flow, redirecting the trade flow.